Killer of Rome by Tim Whalen. Chapter 39. Detective Wilson walked into Dr. Moss's office. The spacious room basked in the afternoon sun, its large windows overlooking the busy street below. Several patients sat in the reception area. A tall, middle-aged, and imposing nurse was cooing and tickling a baby sitting in its mother's lap. As Wilson approached, the nurse's attention shifted, her eyes tightening as she assessed the young man in the crisp suit and blonde hair. Her professional manner took over, and she displayed guarded curiosity.
"Is Dr. Moss in?"
Wilson asked, with authority. The nurse gave Detective Wilson the once-over before responding.
"He is with a patient. He is booked for the rest of the day. I can make an appointment."
Her words trailed off as Wilson produced his LAPD badge, the polished metal catching the light and causing the nurse's eyes to widen in surprise. At that precise moment, the door to the outside hallway swung open, and a patrolman stepped inside, his presence adding to the seriousness of the detective's inquiry. Wilson's stare met the nurse's eyes.
"Please get Dr. Moss, now."
Shaken by the sudden turn of events, the nurse smiled curtly and made her way to a closed door, her knuckles rapping against the hard surface with a sense of urgency. Long seconds ticked by before the door opened, and Dr. David Moss emerged. A pleasant-looking man with a mild demeanor, Dr. Moss began to question his nurse about the interruption. His words faltered as he saw the two police officers standing just a few feet away. About 45 minutes later, Dr. Moss sat still at the table in an interview room, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the blank walls. On the other side of a one-way mirror, 4 men stood motionless. The stares of L.A. detectives Thacker and Wilson, along with Dan's and Mike's, were locked on the suspect. The mood in the darkened observation room was quiet. Dan's eyes narrowed as he examined Dr. Moss's impassive face, searching for any sign of guilt or nervousness. The doctor briefly looked at his fingers. Despite his best efforts, some of the ink from his fingerprinting remained. Dr. Moss's only clear emotion was confusion over why he was there. Given the gravity of the crimes he was suspected of, this was odd. Wilson shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his mind racing through the evidence they had gathered. The connections were undeniable. Dr. Moss had been in Rome when Maria Albano was killed, and he was in Los Angeles when the 4 murders were committed. His medical expertise made him more than capable of drugging victims and performing the gruesome task of removing a uterus. The suspect's direct connections to most of the victims seemed to seal his fate. The fingers of Senior Detective Colin Thacker's right hand were wrapped around a short, unlit cigar, tapping it in an impatient rhythm against his thigh. He and the others waited for Rice to return with a fingerprint match that would be the final nail in Dr. Moss's coffin. Mike frowned.
"I don't think he knows why he's here."
Thacker turned to face his colleague. The veteran cop had been in this exact situation many times before.
Doesn't matter. When Rice gets back with the fingerprint match, we will charge him. We know for a fact that 3 of the 5 women were his patients. I'm sure we will get a connection to the other 2.
Dan nodded, his eyes still on Dr. Moss through the one-way mirror. The door to the observation room opened, and Sergeant Hank Kowalski entered. His larger-than-life presence made the room feel full.
"Hank, thanks for getting here so fast."
Mike gestured to the 2 men in the room that were unknown to Hank.
"Sergeant Hank Kowalski, this is Senior Detective Thacker and Detective Wilson."
The men exchanged handshakes. Thacker smiled briefly, then turned back to the mirror, pointing at Dr. Moss on the other side.
Sergeant, I'm told you were present when an argument broke out in a doctor's office in Rome in 1946?
Thacker looked for a confirmation from Hank. When he got it, Thacker asked a second question.
Is this the man you saw at that time?
Hank studied Dr. Moss carefully, aware of the importance of his identification. He looked directly at Thacker and stated firmly,
That's him.
Any doubt?
Thacker pressed, seeking absolute certainty.
None. He was my doctor. Saw him several times.
Detective Thacker's satisfaction was evident as he heard the witness's unwavering certainty. He turned to Dan, ready to go.
Let's get started.
It was time to confront their suspect and unravel the truth behind the gruesome murders that had plagued his city. Dan Kelly and Detective Thacker entered the interview room. Dr. Moss looked up at them, a little nervous and confused as they took their seats across the table. The overhead lights cast hard shadows on their faces. The older detective took the lead.
Dr. Moss, I'm Senior Detective Colin Thacker of the Los Angeles Police. This is Detective Dan Kelly of the Redstone Police.
Dr. Moss was cautious, a hint of confusion in his eyes.
Hello?
He was a little unsteady. Thacker continued, leaning forward as he set up his line of questioning.
Detective Kelly was in Rome during the occupation. At that time, he was an army officer acting as liaison with the Rome police. I believe you were in Rome as well?
A look of relief crossed Dr. Moss's face as he heard something specific and known.
Yes, I was. I was part of a group of doctors sent over by Save. They set me up in an empty store. What is this about?
Thacker's gaze stayed on the doctor.
We will get to that. You had a patient in Rome, Maria Albano.
Dr. Moss hesitated, not entirely sure.
Possibly. We were very busy.
Detective Thacker reached into a folder and pulled out a morgue photo of Maria Albano's face, placing it in front of Dr. Moss.
This is Maria Albano.
The doctor's eyes grew large as he looked at the picture.
What did this woman die of?
Dan cut in. She was killed with a sword. Dr. Moss opened his mouth, forming the word "what" without making a sound. Dan clarified.
It was an ornamental Nazi sword.
The old detective placed a photo of the sword in front of Dr. Moss, next to the one of Maria Albano. Dr. Moss bent closer to examine the photographs. After a brief moment, he shook his head.
I do not remember this woman. I've never seen a sword like that.
Thacker's eyes narrowed.
We have a witness who saw you arguing with her.
He turned to the mirror and nodded. 10 seconds later, the door opened, and Hank Kowalski entered the room. The doctor realized for the first time he was in the middle of a choreographed interrogation. Thacker motioned toward the newcomer.
Dr. Moss, this is Sergeant Hank Kowalski, who was also one of your patients.
The two men exchanged nods of recognition. Dr. Moss appeared to be pleased to see Hank, who stood at ease. Dan turned to the big sergeant.
Sergeant, tell us what you witnessed in Dr. Moss's office.
Hank took a moment as he prepared to give testimony about the events that had brought them all here.
Like I told Captain Fiorante.
Hank was relaxed as he spoke.
There was a hell of a fight going on in one of the examination rooms.
He described the scene, painting a picture of Dr. Moss's temporary clinic in a Roman storefront. It had partitions made of curtains instead of hard walls. Hank said the waiting room was filled with several bored patients, including himself. Then suddenly, the air was pierced by a woman cursing loudly in an obscenity-filled tirade in Italian. The occasional English curse word was audible. The profanity caused embarrassment in about half the patients, amusement in the rest.
I'll admit, I was more on the entertained side.
Hank grew more animated as he reached the climax of the incident.
Then all of a sudden, this curtain bursts open, and out charges Maria Albano, mad as hell. I had seen Maria riled up, but not like this.
He paused, stifling a laugh despite the seriousness of the situation.
She tore through that clinic room like a tornado, still cursing up a storm. Didn't slow down for nothing or nobody. She was great.
His admiration for Maria's fiery spirit was clear. He described the aftermath of Maria's extraordinary exit, likening it to the vacuum left after an explosion.
A few seconds later, this old nurse comes through the same curtains looking for Maria. Poor thing was red as a beet. Probably never heard cursing like that in her life.
Hank chuckled and shook his head.
And then,
looking at Dr. Moss.
Dr. Moss himself comes out, looking at the nurse, bewildered. It was quite a ruckus, I tell you. Some fireworks.
As Hank finished his account, the room fell silent, except for a snicker from Dr. Moss. Dan and Thacker were surprised by this behavior. The doctor was about to be accused of Maria Albano's murder, and he was laughing. Dr. Moss pushed his chair back, a smile playing on his lips as he gave his version of that chaotic day in Rome. The memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday, not 4 years ago.
I remember that, although my perspective is a little different. It was a typical busy day in our makeshift clinic. I was in one of the examination rooms talking to a worried mother about her sick boy. The child was running a fever, and I was explaining the treatment when the most extraordinary commotion erupted from the cubicle next door.
Dr. Moss's mood lightened as he went on with his story.
The sergeant is right. The language was like nothing I'd ever heard. It was a torrent of Italian curses, peppered with some rather colorful English.
The doctor's hands moved rapidly as he talked. Dan remained confused by the doctor's behavior. He either didn't care or didn't understand the trouble he was in.
I tried to ignore it at first, but it was impossible. I had to excuse myself from the mother and child. I went into the cubicle next door, not knowing what the hell was going on. As I entered, all I could see was the back of a young Italian woman storming out. She was a whirlwind of dark hair and flailing arms, still shouting obscenities. I've never seen anyone so angry in my life. Janet, my nurse, was riled up, just like the sergeant said. She followed the woman into the reception area, probably hoping to calm her down. I followed right behind, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. When I got there, she was gone.
Dr. Moss's eyes met those of the detectives.
It was quite a spectacle, I must say. Not something you easily forget.
Thacker leaned forward. He needed to clarify a crucial detail about the clinic's layout.
So it was possible to get from one examining room to another without going through your reception area?
Oh yes, it was just curtains.
Thacker's stare shifted to Sergeant Kowalski, seeking confirmation. He gave the sergeant a questioning glance, asking if this aligned with his recollection of the clinic's setup. Hank responded with a quick, affirmative nod. The detective rolled the unlit cigar stub from one side of his mouth to the other. Dr. Moss sat relaxed in his chair.
But the sergeant is wrong. That wasn't embarrassment on Janet's face. She was angry. I've worked with Janet for 10 years. Never seen her that angry.
The doctor's words brought the interrogation to a stop. Dan and Thacker regrouped, their previous assumptions now challenged.
What was she angry about? Your nurse.
Anderson, Janet Anderson. The patient was a prostitute. We treated everyone, but we were under directives from the Army to specifically deal with venereal diseases among prostitutes. I did not remember her name. They usually gave false names anyway. Janet had told this woman...
Maria Albano.
Dan supplied.
Yes, of course. Janet had told Maria that she had gonorrhea and that a treatment of penicillin would clear it up. When Janet informed her that we had no penicillin and that she would have to abstain from sex until we got a supply, the woman exploded.
The doctor exhaled slowly. The memory had left its mark.
Janet tried to reason with her, but she would not hear it. Maria said she felt fine and then launched into her blue rant.
Dr. Moss shook his head and smiled. The absurdity of the little drama still apparent after all this time. The detectives were fixed on Dr. Moss while they mentally added this new information to what they already knew. Thacker was puzzled,
You were out of penicillin?
curious as much as anything.
The black market. Supplies were always short, penicillin in particular.
Dan agreed.
He's right. It was a big problem.
When the supply ran low, we were instructed, again by the Army, to give penicillin to U.S. personnel only. When we told the Army we would not make that distinction, they cut us off. We were told to send any American who needed penicillin to the Army hospital. The situation did improve about a month later.
Hank, who had been listening stoically from his position near the door, chimed in.
That's true. Right after it happened, I was told by the nurse to go to the Army hospital to get my shot.
Thacker's eyes darted between Dr. Moss and Hank as he tried to figure out where to go next. The interview had taken an unexpected turn. In the observation room, on the other side of the glass, Detective Wilson and Mike Fiorante stood side by side, taking in everything of the scene unfolding in front of them. The door to the observation room swung open. Detective Rice came in. He had news.
Got the fingerprint results.
But instead of triumph, there was a hint of something else. Something off. Wilson's heart rate quickened. This could be it.
Is it a match?
He was unable to tamp down his expectations. Rice's response, however, was far from clear-cut.
Yes and no.
Wilson and Mike exchanged bewildered glances. A minute later, Rice entered the interview room, carrying a file folder and Dr. Moss's appointment book. Thacker stopped the interview. Rice approached Thacker and whispered urgently in his ear. Thacker's face was impassive as he listened to Rice, though his right hand, hidden beneath the table, clenched into a fist. Years of experience helped him maintain his composure, but inside, his mind raced to realign everything they thought they knew about the case. Rice put the file folder and appointment book on the table before taking a couple of steps back. Thacker allowed himself a slow, deliberate breath, buying time to process the stunning development Rice had provided. His eyes went briefly to Dr. Moss, seeing him in an entirely new light. The unlit cigar in his mouth remained motionless as he carefully considered his next move. With his thoughts gathered, he turned to Dr. Moss.
What did your nurse, Janet Anderson, say to you after the argument?
Dr. Moss looked upward as he recalled the conversation.
After she cooled off, she told me she was going to track the girl, prostitute, down. She felt she could make her understand. I told her it wasn't our job and that the name she gave was probably an alias, but Janet was determined.
Thacker gave a tight smile. The doctor's account was consistent with the new information whispered into his ear by Detective Rice.
Was anyone else in your office, besides you and Janet, also in Rome?
Just Janet and I.
Thacker rapped his knuckles on the appointment book, drawing everyone's attention to it.
One last question, Doctor. Who in your office has access to your appointment book?
Dr. Moss shrugged slightly.
Everyone, really. But it's Janet's job to keep it up to date.
Thacker paused dramatically, his eyes fixed on the doctor. The apprehension in the room was tangible as everyone waited for his next words.
Doctor, I'm most sorry to have to tell you that 4 Los Angeles women have been killed in a manner very similar to the way Maria Albano was killed in Rome 4 years ago. We also know that 2 of the recently murdered women were patients of yours.
Dr. Moss's eyes widened in shock as Detective Thacker's words sank in. The color drained from his face, and he fell back in his chair, visibly shaken. Dan paid close attention to the doctor's reaction. He was surprised by Thacker's decision to reveal so much information all at once.
4 women? Killed like the woman in Rome?
Thacker got to the heart of the matter.
We have evidence that ties directly to the killer. Prints on these items match fingerprints on your appointment book.
Dr. Moss's hands began to tremble, and he gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. The idea that he was somehow connected to these horrific crimes was overwhelming. Thacker paused again before delivering the final, shocking revelation, his fingers drumming once again against the metal table.
And finally, Doctor, the matching fingerprints on the evidence and the appointment book are not yours.
Thacker said calmly. Thacker's words landed like a sledgehammer. The interview room went silent. They all realized that Colin Thacker was now accusing Janet Anderson, a nurse, of 5 murders. Dr. Moss, full of disbelief, shook his head vehemently.
That can't be.
He was stupefied. Hank, who had not spoken throughout the exchange, couldn't contain his astonishment.
That old girl.
Through the thick glass of the observation window, Wilson and Mike watched as the identity of the killer washed over 5 men: Thacker, Dan Kelly, Rice, Hank Kowalski, and Dr. Moss, like a river. An extended silence was broken only by Dr. Moss's ragged breathing as he struggled to understand the charges being made against his nurse and friend. Wilson's mind raced, trying to reconcile everything they thought they knew about these murders with this new, startling possibility. A woman. They had never even considered it. The brutality of the crimes and the physical strength needed to overpower the victims had all pointed to a man, or so they had thought. In the interview room, Dr. Moss sat slumped in his chair, his earlier composure completely shattered. Dan saw the doctor's hands tremble as he reached for a glass of water, nearly knocking it over in his distress. Thacker pulled the unlit cigar from his mouth and placed it deliberately on the table, his movements small, despite the gravity of his revelation. Rice stacked the papers into a neat pile, as if the physical act might help make sense of the chaos. That was now their new reality. Now, the LAPD would need to move fast. Janet Anderson had to be found before she could strike again. Dan knew the next few hours would be crucial. They needed to locate her and bring her in. Chapter 40. Dan emerged from the interview room as Detectives Thacker, Rice, and Wilson hurried off toward the exit. They were on their way to Janet Anderson's home, and they wouldn't spare the horses. As Dan's eyes adjusted to the brighter light, he was met by reporter Casey Thompson standing a few feet away, her face full of expectation. Dan had called her earlier, keeping his promise to include Thompson in the final stage of the investigation. A pang of regret shot through Dan as he now knew his assumption about Dr. Moss had been wrong. Casey shifted her eyes between Dan and Dr. Moss and back again. The doctor was slumped in a chair next to a desk, his energy sapped. To the reporter, He looked nothing like the murderer of 5 women.
Is he the killer?
Dan shook his head wearily,
No.
sounding rough and croaky.
Wait here, Casey. We're not done yet.
Turning away from Casey's confused expression, Dan walked over to Dr. Moss. Dan put a phone in front of the doctor and stood by patiently as he dialed Janet's number. The ringing dragged on. Each unanswered ring increased the doctor's anxiety. With a sad shake of his head, Dr. Moss lowered the phone. Dan gave him a supportive look. He knew the LAPD was on it. They would find Janet Anderson soon. And if she was indeed the killer, of which there seemed little doubt, then this would be over. At the end of the hall, Mike talked to Hank Kowalski, thanking him for coming. Hank was a big man and not easily rattled. But Dan could see on his face that the revelation that these brutal killings were likely done by a middle-aged woman, a nurse, had knocked him for a loop. He was not alone in that. Minutes later, Mike gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the Green Army car through the streets of Los Angeles. Dan sat beside him in the passenger seat, his eyes on the road ahead. In the back, Dr. Moss and Casey Thompson sat together in silence. Dan turned in his seat to address Dr. Moss.
She will be there.
Dr. Moss sighed, resignation evident in his tone.
She is a woman of regular habits.
He paused, realizing how absurd his statement sounded, given the situation.
This must be a mistake,
He said mostly to himself.
We will know soon enough.
Mike glanced in the rearview mirror, catching Dr. Moss's slight nod of agreement. The doctor's eyes were distant, lost in thought. Casey Thompson leaned forward and broke the silence.
What can you tell us about Janet?
She needed to know. She also knew the troubled doctor needed to be distracted. Dr. Moss blinked, focusing on Casey. The sympathetic look he got from the woman reporter helped him relax.
She's my nurse. She's a great nurse and great friend. Been with me since I started.
His words came out in disjointed bits.
From a little town in Minnesota.
Moss shrugged.
Became a nurse later than most. My second daughter is Kelsey Janet. Janet is her godmother.
He rambled. Casey edged closer, her pen poised over her notebook.
Married?
She asked, then offered a little smile.
She married Lars during the Great War. They don't talk. Haven't talked for years. Sorry, just remembered. He recently died, so she's a widow.
How'd he die?
Her curiosity piqued. The doctor's rambling suddenly ceased.
That's complicated,
He said haltingly, barely above a whisper. Dr. Moss seemed to shrink under the weight of their attention. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, swallowing hard.
Lars came back from the Great War with syphilis.
The words seemed to hurt him as he said them, as if betraying a confidence. Dan turned further in his seat, his eyes fixed on the doctor. Mike checked the rearview mirror again, while the reporter stayed ready to capture every word. Dr. Moss explained.
It went undiagnosed for years. I remember Janet telling me that she did not know that diseases like syphilis even existed or how they were transmitted.
He paused, taking a deep breath before going on.
By the time they were accurately diagnosed, Janet was sterile. The effects on Lars were much worse. They separated, they are Catholic, so they never divorced.
This information answered a question for Dan.
So that's when she decided to become a nurse?
The doctor smiled sadly.
Yes. She didn't want what happened to her to happen to any other woman. In Rome, she took a special interest in these women, like this Maria, the sergeant described.
As he spoke, Dr. Moss's distress became more evident. His hands twisted in his lap, and he took on a pleading tone.
That's why this doesn't make any sense. When we got back to California, she made it her mission to help these women. She worked with county health. She worked with the women that everyone else shunned.
Dr. Moss leaned forward, his words tumbling out faster.
Janet's got this thing about teaching. Every week she runs these classes, tells them what to watch out for, hammers home the importance of condoms. You should see her face light up when she talks about penicillin. Swears it's a gift from God.
His eyes locked onto KC's, wanting her to understand.
These girls, they don't trust Easy, but they trust Janet. Hell, they love her, call her Aunt Janet and everything.
KC reached for the doctor's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze, which seemed to settle him. He sagged back in his seat. Dan could see the conflict in the doctor's eyes, the struggle between his loyalty to Janet and the mounting evidence against her.
Can't be. Can't be.
Chapter 41. The army car came to an abrupt stop in front of a small blue bungalow. Dr. Moss was out of the vehicle before it had fully stopped, rushing toward the front door with desperate energy. Dan, Mike, and Casey followed. As they approached the entrance, they saw Detectives Thacker, Rice, and Wilson talking on the porch. Detective Thacker's eyes met Dan's. The older man gave a slight, solemn shake of his head. The silent communication was unmistakable. Seeing Casey Thompson, the detective looked at Dan Kelly, and then at the reporter. Thacker was aware of the deal Dan had made with Thompson. To be there at the end. Nonetheless, Dan could see that Thacker was concerned about a young woman coming face to face with what was inside.
It'll be okay.
Dan, Mike, and KC entered the house, their footsteps echoing in the hallway that ran all the way to the back. The group made their way to Janet's bedroom, where a scene of tragedy awaited them. Janet Anderson lay across the bed, her body still and lifeless. Her face was distorted, marred by large blisters around her open mouth. She was wearing a pale rose cotton dress that was neat in appearance, but its white lace collar seemed decades out of fashion. Her hands were locked, grabbing handfuls of bedding in each. And in one hand, a rosary wove its way through her fingers, a last gesture of faith. Dr. Moss was already at her side, frantically searching for any sign of life, his movements growing more desperate with each passing second. Casey Thompson stopped at the door. With the exception of her grandfather's funeral, she had never seen a dead body before. She inhaled and walked in. Dan's eyes swept across the room, taking in the details. It was a modest space, neat and orderly. Framed photographs adorned the walls, snapshots of a life, now ended. A small table sat in the corner, its surface covered with medical journals and patient files. The air was rich with the scent of lavender rising from a vase of wilting flowers on the nightstand. Near the window, a desk held the grim evidence of Janet's crimes and her last act. A hypodermic, bottles of chloral hydrate, vials of sodium pentobarbital, a knife, a typewriter, and a stack of tan stationery were laid out with meticulous care. A handwritten note, the last testament of a troubled soul, sat atop the pile. Mike picked up the note and began to read aloud.
By now you will know that David is innocent. He is the best of men. He is a doctor. God's greatest gift is to be a mother. That gift was taken from me. These women cared nothing for it, as if it were nothing. They played with the lives of men. In Rome, I offered Maria money to wait, until I could get her penicillin. She threw it in my face. She laughed. She said Yankee soldiers deserve whatever they get.
David Moss, overcome with emotion, sank onto the bed beside Janet's body. He gently took her lifeless hand in his, tears streaming down his face.
She was family. Like my sister.
Whispering and choked with grief.
I tried hard to help my girls. Most thank me and change for better ways, safer ways, but not all. Some came back again and again, one infection after another. How can they act this way? They are playing with men's lives, playing with God's gift to them. It has to end.
Mike continued reading, his words frustrating the silence that wanted to fill the room.
I hope God can forgive me. It's signed Janet Anderson, R.N.
Then, the silence got what it wanted and spread to every corner of the room as Janet's confession settled over them. Dan watched as Dr. Moss's world crumbled before his eyes. The case was solved, but this victory rang hollow in the face of such misfortune, such sorrow. Dan Kelly placed a comforting hand on Dr. Moss's shoulder, feeling the man's body tremble beneath his touch. The room was thick with pain and unanswered questions. Dr. Moss's eyes were distant, lost in memories. A minute later, he began to speak.
In the spring, Janet got word. Her husband, Lars, was dead. It took a lot out of her.
He turned to look at Dan, searching for understanding in the detective's eyes.
I was surprised by how upset she was. They hadn't talked in 10 years.
Dan could see the confusion and sorrow on Dr. Moss's face. The doctor's next words came out as a plea.
Does any of this make sense?
Casey, ever the journalist, seized on this information.
How did he die? Her husband.
Dr. Moss's shoulders sagged as he began to explain. He had both a doctor's and a friend's knowledge of Janet's sad story.
Before penicillin, syphilis could ravage the body and the mind. It was horrible if not treated.
He shook his head, unable to finish the thought, and let his eyes drop. After a moment, he said, almost too soft to hear.
This way.
Casey, sensing there was more, asked,
Doctor, how exactly did he die?
Dr. Moss's gaze fell to Janet's lifeless form on the bed. His eyes welled up with tears. When he spoke again, his voice broke with emotion.
This way.
Gesturing weakly towards Janet's body.
He drank lye.
Mike's throat tightened as he remembered a story from years ago in Queens. His Zia Connie, a nurse, told him about a man who drank lye. The man's screams echoed through the hospital corridors. The victim thrashed in agony for hours, his insides burning away. They could only wait and give him morphine. Looking at Janet's body now, Mike was struck by how peaceful she appeared, save for her hands twisted in the bed sheets. Connie told him that the best outcome was for the chemical to burn and swell the throat so severely that the victim asphyxiated quickly. At least then, the torture would end sooner. Janet must have known what she was doing, choosing the same terrible end that had claimed her husband. There was something darkly poetic about it. A cold understanding washed over Dan, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Lars's suicide a few months ago had been Janet's breaking point. After decades of watching her husband suffer, after years of helping other women avoid her fate, the rage and pain she'd carried since Rome, since Maria's cruel laughter, had found its trigger. Janet's mission to help had transformed into something grotesque. Her husband's death was the catalyst that ignited her reign of terror. It all ended here in this little room that smelled of lavender. An hour later, Janet Anderson's body was gone, and Dr. Moss had been driven home by the police. The small bungalow, a scene of darkest tragedy, now buzzed with the activity of law enforcement, wrapping up their investigation. Dan and Mike rested against their car, indifferent to the comings and goings around Janet's house. Right now, they needed the car to hold them up. The hunt was over. They had found their killer. The case files would show justice served. But victory tasted like ash as they now knew the trail of grief that had led to this moment. Casey Thompson had spent most of the past hour on the phone talking to her paper, The LA Standard. Her excitement barely reined in as she worked furiously from her notes. She'd enlisted 3 copywriters, each tackling different aspects of the story, with Mike Fiorante standing by to provide critical details when needed. Then, Casey, as happy as a kid on Christmas morning, left by cab, her notebook bulging with the makings of what she knew would thrill the citizens of Los Angeles for days to come. As Casey disappeared, Dan was trying to make sense of the day's events when Detective Rice approached him.
You know what's crazy? I saw her just a few nights ago. Me and Carl Archer were canvassing our old neighborhood.
Dan straightened up, his attention caught.
You saw Janet Anderson.
Yeah, she was out there, handing out pamphlets and condoms to working girls.
Rice's voice held a note of incredulity.
She was imposing, had this presence about her.
Dan could picture it clearly. Janet Anderson, the nurse who dedicated her life to helping others, still carrying out her mission, even as she pursued her dark purpose.
Can you believe it?
Rice asked, his voice just above a whisper. Rice walked away, shaking his head. 10 minutes later, Dan and Mike looked like 2 tired souls as Senior Detective Colin Thacker walked up to them. The older detective, by way of contrast, was brimming with satisfaction.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thacker said enthusiastically, shaking hands with each of them while placing his other hand on their shoulders. He looked them in the eye, waiting for them to return his gaze. They did, though their expressions were far less happy than Thacker's.
I know right now it may be small consolation, but I believe your work, your insight, likely saved the lives of other women.
He underlined his statement by vigorously shaking his head up and down, as if to say, "Yes, you did this." Mike was subdued.
We were so sure it was one of ours, a soldier, a sailor, a Marine. We were certain that only the pain of the war could drive someone to do such things.
But it was a different war, and a different kind of pain.
Thacker was undeterred by their dark mood.
Boys, you solved this case.
He turned to Dan with a smile.
I'll have to tell Angus he was right. You are better than we were.
He laughed generously.
In a few days, you brought an end to this madness.
The senior detective swept his arm at Janet Anderson's home behind him.
We had gotten nowhere in months.
Thacker's enthusiasm was unwavering. Realizing his words weren't having the desired effect, he added,
Take the win, boys.
With a flourish, Thacker pulled 3 new cigars from his pocket. He offered one to Dan and Mike, who both declined. Undaunted, he returned 2 to his pocket and made an elaborate show of lighting the 3rd. Puffing on the cigar and grinning, he got into a waiting patrol car. He gave Dan and Mike a wink. He reached through the open window and pounded the car's roof twice. Then, he flashed a smile as wide as the Pacific and sped away. Dan and Mike were left in the middle of the street to ponder the empty triumph that was their win. They had been so certain, so invested in the idea that the killer was one of their own, a soldier damaged by the war. Instead, they'd found Janet Anderson, a nurse whose life had been shattered by a different kind of assault. The syphilis that robbed her of motherhood and ruined her life. turned her into something neither of them could have predicted: a vengeful angel of death. While the critical insight that had led them to Dr. Moss and ultimately to this small house with its tragic occupant had been theirs, Dan and Mike did not feel triumphant. The sum of Janet's story, her transformation from healer to killer, sat heavy on Dan's chest. It had been 4 years since that fateful rainy night in Rome when they were called to Marie Albano's apartment. For 4 years, they had been haunted by her lifeless face, staring unseeing at the ceiling. For 4 years, they had carried guilt because they hadn't caught the killer in Rome, despite being ordered not to even try. The burden of that failure had followed them across an ocean and half a continent. Now, the case was solved. The chaos was over. But as Dan stood there in the fading evening light, there was no joy, only a profound sadness for all that had been lost. Mike spoke.
We should go.
As Dan Kelly got in Mike Fiorante's car, he had no way of knowing that solving the case was only the beginning. The quiet drive back to Redstone and Camp Carson would be their last moment of peace for weeks to come. As the sun dipped into the Pacific, headlines were already rolling off the presses at the LA Standard, and phones were ringing in newsrooms from San Francisco to New York. Dan longed for normalcy, life in Redstone, time with friends and family, and golf with Ted. But fate and the American public's insatiable appetite for sensational stories had other plans. Chapter 42. 3 weeks later, George Ramirez sat at his desk, reading his notes as he recounted the events that had engulfed Redstone in the past 3 weeks. The town was now in the national spotlight, thanks to Dan Kelly and Mike Fiorante's incredible exploits. The mob of reporters that had descended upon Redstone was like nothing before. Up until now, the deepest question he had ever been asked by writers, who were almost always doing a piece on scenic Orange County, was,
how did Redstone get its name?
Reporters from far and wide flocked to speak with Dan Kelly, the man who stopped the modern-day Jackie the Ripper. A lot of the media frenzy could be traced back to LAPD's senior detective Colin Thacker, who had practically shoved Dan and Mike into the spotlight.
Gentlemen and ladies, I give you Dan Kelly of the Redstone Police and Captain Mike Ferrante, United States Army.
At first, George had attributed it to professional courtesy, maybe even generosity. But now, watching the gaggle of reporters that had invaded Redstone, he wondered if there wasn't more to it. Thacker was a veteran who'd seen his share of high-profile cases. He had to have known what kind of chaos would follow. George couldn't help but smile at the thought that maybe, just maybe, redirecting the media circus to their quiet town was Thacker's idea of a practical joke. It would explain the knowing smirk on the detective's face during that first press conference, the day after the killer had been found, dead. The first reporter to arrive, of course, had been Casey Thompson, now something of a celebrity herself in the world of newspapers. George was surprised to find the tough reporting he had read under the byline K.C. Thompson to be the work of a pretty young woman. Clearly, he had to update his assumptions. George fondly recalled his conversation with Casey.
So, Mr. Ramirez, can you tell me more about the town's reaction to Dan Kelly's heroic actions?
George had chuckled, knowing full well the reporter intended to milk this story for all it was worth.
Well, KC,
He'd replied, no stranger to BS himself.
Redstone's never seen anything quite like this. We're a small town, you know.
By far, George's favorite piece in the LA Standard, under the byline K.C. Thompson, was the one where she had interviewed a trio of eminent psychiatrists about what had motivated Janet Anderson. When Casey got to the question, why did she take their wombs? The amount of double talk and psychiatric nonsense they spewed was sheer delight. George found himself thinking about Kate's diner, where he witnessed Dan suffer through a parade of reporters. He'd sat in on nearly all of them, offering town history and color. For his efforts, he had been described in some of the articles as sage-like and Redstone's town historian.
Not bad,
He thought with a grin. Dan's experience had been a little different.
I swear,
Dan grumbled after a particularly long day of interviews.
if I have to answer one more question about how I felt at that moment, I might just lose it. At least Mike has the U.S. Army to protect them from all this,
said Dan, waving his hand dismissively. Now, sitting in his creaky office chair, a typewriter and a blank sheet of paper were staring George down. Soon, the familiar clickety-clack of his old Remington proclaimed that George Ramirez, owner and editor of the Redstone Record, was working.
Redstone has always been a special place. Folks here know their neighbors, leave their doors unlocked, and greet each other with a warm smile and a friendly wave. It's the kind of place where time seems to slow down, where the simple pleasures of life are savored and cherished. But lately, things have been different. The quiet streets of Redstone have been abuzz with excitement, as reporters from hither and yon descended upon us, all clamoring for a glimpse of our very own local hero, Detective Dan Kelly.
George paused, considering his next words, then surged ahead.
It all started with 4 terrible murders in Los Angeles. 4 brutal killings that might have shaken the City of Angels to its core. When the LAPD found themselves stumped and in need of help, they called for Detective Dan Kelly and Captain Mike Fiorante to lend a hand. And boy, did they deliver. Dan Kelly, our police department's senior detective, is a fixture in Redstone. With his easy charm and sharp mind, he's the kind of lawman who makes you feel safe just by his presence. And while Captain Mike Fiorante may not officially call Redstone home, his face is as well known to the town as the clock tower on Main Street. Stationed at Camp Carson, the good captain has become an honorary citizen of Redstone.
George Ramirez tilted back in his chair, a proud smile playing on his lips.
It's been quite a ride.
His hands coaxed more magic from the keys.
These are men who embody the very best of small-town values. They're honest, hard-working, and dedicated to serving their communities. They don't seek glory or recognition. They simply do what needs to be done because it's the right thing to do. This is the true nature of heroism.
For a moment, George entertained the notion of delving into the horrific aspects of the crimes. He shook it off, certain that focusing on the positive was the way to go.
That's why men like Dan Kelly and Mike Fiorante are so special. They remind us of what's truly important. They have shown us what real heroes look like. They don't wear capes in comic books or star in big-screen westerns. They wear badges and uniforms, and they put their lives on the line every day to keep us safe. The excitement that has gripped Redstone is being enjoyed by all. Well, except for Dan Kelly.
He smirked and went on.
Redstone finds itself at the center of a big story, not for its scenic beauty, but for the courage and integrity of 2 of its own.
George interlaced his fingers behind his head and leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking in familiar protest. Out of the window, he could see the accustomed sights of Main Street. Shops in the afternoon sun, cars angling into parking spots, and townspeople strolling past on their daily errands. Then he turned back to his typewriter with fresh energy, ready to bring it home.
Let us not forget the lessons we've learned from this whirlwind of attention. Let us remember that true strength lies not in the size of our town, but in the character of our citizens. Let us continue to nurture the values that make Redstone special: kindness, community, and a commitment to doing what's right.
When typing kindness and community, George Ramirez was reminded of the struggling Peters family he had recently met. Patience and her kids, Frank and Carrie. He knew Redstone, and he knew the town would lift their spirits. Now, time for the bang-up finish.
And to Dan Kelly and Mike Fiorante, we say thank you. Thank you for showing the world what Redstone is made of. Thank you for reminding us all what real heroism looks like. And thank you for making us proud to call Redstone our home.
Satisfied, George typed 30 at the bottom of the page, cranked it up and out of his Remington, and set it aside. Now, he had a party to go to. 10 minutes later, and 6 blocks away, George walked into the lively scene unfolding in Marty McDougal's backyard. The air was filled with the aroma of grilling burgers and the cheerful chatter of 24 guests. Marty had thrown this barbecue to mark Dan and Mike's heroics, and the atmosphere was one of celebration. Calvin Lafayette, his wife Clara, and their toddler Grace were seated with Kate and Mike, all of them eyeing Allie as she flipped burgers on the grill. Allie was trying her best to look like she knew what she was doing. But Calvin, a master of the grill, wasn't convinced. Leaning toward Kate, Calvin whispered,
"Are you sure about this?"
Kate, amused by Calvin's concern, said,
"It's fine."
"You know, I could..."
Calvin started, but Kate cut him off.
"It's our day off,"
she said emphatically, underlining her declaration with a happy nod.
"I know, but..."
Kate, enjoying Calvin's worry over something as simple as hamburgers, ended the discussion with,
"It's fine,"
while playing with Grace and smiling. Just then, one of Allie's burgers caught fire. She awkwardly dumped the charred patty and called out,
"The hamburgers are ready."
Inside the house, Marty proudly showed Dan the new wheel-in shower Calvin had built for him. It had a concrete base, tiled walls, handholds, a fold-away seat, and a shower curtain with the United States Marine Corps emblem on it.
You can slide the shower up and down. See? The low position is for me,
Marty explained, demonstrating how the shower head could accommodate different heights.
And the high position?
Dan asked, impressed. With a wink and a roll of his eyes, Marty quipped,
long-legged redheads.
Dan grinned and thumped his old buddy on the back. Outside by the dessert table, Father Ted, dressed in casual clothes, greeted Mark Hinks as he arrived. The priest's eyes twinkled with warmth as he extended his hand.
"You must be Daniel's friend. Mark?"
Mark seemed distracted, but he made an effort to focus on Ted. He shook his hand firmly.
"That's me."
"I'm Father Ted. Ted Gorski."
The priest introduced himself, stopping before using his formal title.
"Mark Hinks,"
Mark replied, returning the introduction. Mark placed a pie on a table laden with colorful salads and tempting desserts.
"Dad says you were in Sicily and Italy,"
Ted asked, his tone casual but interested. Mark's response was offhand, almost dismissive.
"I landed at Anzio."
Ted's stance shifted noticeably.
"That was rough."
Mark acknowledged Ted's words with a quick nod, but his eyes held a hint of skepticism. He couldn't imagine how this large, polite man could truly understand the horror of Anzio. While he did appreciate the man's intentions, he had a hard time not finding such well-meaning words, a little patronizing. As they sat down, Ted opened 2 bottles of Coke, handing one to Mark. Noticing Mark's lack of interest, Ted decided to share a bit of his own history.
I was at Monte Cassino.
Father Ted said, waiting for a reaction. Mark's attention snapped back. Now, he was really confused. He eyed Ted's big frame, trying to reconcile it with the image of a soldier. It's not possible, he thought. Ted understood Mark's bewilderment.
Polish Second Corps,
he explained. Seeing that Mark was still puzzled, he added,
I was a chaplain. I'm a priest.
Realization dawned on Mark's face. Then, he happily raised his Coke in a gesture of respect.
Here's to you, my friend.
His voice carrying a new note of camaraderie. A little while later, Dan, Marty, and Calvin found themselves in Marty's expansive woodworking shop. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust and lacquer, evidence of Calvin's recent work.
So, Calvin did a good job?
Dan asked, his eyes roaming over the impressive array of tools and machinery. Marty's face lit up with pride.
Oh yeah, first rate. He does a fair job of cleaning up too,
he said as he winked at Calvin. Calvin smiled modestly at the compliment, his hands instinctively running along the smooth surface of a nearby workbench. Dan turned to Calvin, a mischievous glint in his eye.
Calvin, Kate says you can't stop talking about this place.
Nicest setup I've seen,
Calvin said, his voice filled with admiration. Dan cocked his head.
Could you make some cabinets? Like for a kitchen?
Calvin hesitated as he fessed up to his lack of skills.
I've never done anything like that. That's finishing work. You need a special touch.
Dan's eyes went wide as he opened his arms to take in the entire shop. Looking directly at Calvin.
Everything you need is here.
Then he turned to his old pal, the ex-Marine in a wheelchair.
Marty, if we build more ramps to get you up higher, could you help Calvin? Show him what he needs to know?
Marty's face broke into a broad smile.
Sure. Hell yeah. What else have I got to do?
As Dan and Marty turned to Calvin, they saw his face light up. Near the barbecue, the Ramirez family was visiting with Kate and Mike. George was giving Mike a hard time about not coming to the record first with the big story.
Mike, I'm so disappointed in you and Dan.
Nobody at the table was buying it. Not his wife, Maria, his daughter, Isabella, and certainly not Kate or Mike.
A story like that could have doubled my circulation.
To what? 2,000?
Kate shot back, beaming.
Kate, my dear, you have cut me to the quick,
said George, who mimicked a near-fatal injury to the enjoyment of all. At that moment, Chico Ramirez entered the backyard with a girl. He had chosen the relative safety of Marty's barbecue to introduce her to his family. The girl, whose name was Patty, had been warned as to what to expect. His father's eyes lit up.
Chico, she's so pretty. Has she met you before?
Chico struggled to make himself heard over the laughter that followed. He put up his hands, partly to quiet his family and partly as a sign of acceptance.
Okay, this is Patty.
Then, with a tone signaling unconditional surrender, he added,
Let it begin.
His parents jumped up to meet Patty as she whispered coyly to Chico,
Yup, just like you said.
As she was embraced by the Ramirez family. By the time the menu shifted to ice cream and cake, Marty was chasing Frank and Carrie Peters around the yard, their laughter ringing out. The children took turns in Marty's spare wheelchair as their mother, Patience Peters, watched from the sideline. Her face filled with joy at the sight of her children's happiness. For Patience, it was a feeling she'd almost forgotten, which had thankfully returned to her. Dan's voice rose above the chatter, drawing everyone's attention.
Father Ted, did you not tell me that the rectory needs new kitchen cabinets?
Father Ted hesitated for a moment before a broad smile spread across his face.
I did indeed, Daniel. I absolutely did.
Calvin's face shone bright at the prospect of a new project. As the party continued, Dan pulled Mark Hinks from his chair and began introducing him around. As the afternoon drifted into evening, everyone thoroughly enjoyed themselves at Marty McDougal's barbecue. Chapter 43. The Beginning. On a beautiful spring day in 1919, as apple blossoms dotted the trees and meadowlarks trilled their welcome songs, the Chicago train was just minutes away from Shirley Station, its engine chugging across the Minnesota prairie. Janet Anderson stood among the crowd on the old wooden platform, her heart racing in anticipation. The small clapboard station house, its white paint peeling in the sun, had never hosted a gathering like this. A dozen families stood close, all eagerly awaiting the return of their men from the Great War. Through the station's open windows, she could hear the telegraph clicking away and the station master's heavy boots creaking across the worn floorboards as he prepared for the train's arrival. Janet smoothed her pale rose cotton dress, its white lace collar freshly starched for the occasion, and adjusted her delicate hat. The gentle prairie breeze that played with the cottonwoods also carried the sweet scent of spring flowers, crocuses, snowdrops, and daffodils from the station's garden. Janet scanned the horizon for the approaching train. It had been 18 long months since she had last seen her husband, Lars. They were newlyweds, married only 3 months before duty called him away. Now, as she waited, Janet believed she was standing on the edge of a new beginning. The platform was mostly quiet, save for the frequent chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves in the nearby trees, and the soft conversation of friends and family. Janet closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to be transported back in time. She remembered their courtship, the stolen glances and shy smiles that grew into a deep, abiding love. A little smile took her as she recalled their wedding day, how handsome Lars had looked in his suit, his eyes shining with adoration as she walked down the aisle. But one memory in particular made Janet's cheeks flush and her heart race. She thought back to their first time together on a hot summer day by the lake. They had packed a picnic and spent the afternoon talking, laughing, and basking in each other's company. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the water, Lars took her hand and led her to a secluded spot beneath a grand old oak tree. Janet's breath caught in her throat as she recalled the tenderness in Lars' touch, the way his hands had trembled slightly as he undressed her. She could almost feel the softness of the grass under her back, the warmth of Lars's skin next to hers. The memory of seeing him naked and aroused sent a shiver of desire through her body. Her cheeks grew hot, and there was a familiar tightening in her chest as her breasts swelled with longing. Opening her eyes, Janet glanced around the platform, suddenly self-conscious. But there was no one there to witness her moment of private reminiscence. She smoothed her dress again, trying to compose herself. But her mind continued to wander to thoughts of Lars. She imagined their reunion, how it would feel to be in his arms again, to kiss him deeply and passionately. The sound of a train whistle in the distance momentarily broke the pull of memory. Her heart raced as she peered eastward down the tracks, catching sight of the locomotive and its churning black smokestack. Those in waiting began inching closer to the edge of the platform, their excited chatter adding to the growing expectation in the air. The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and a blast of steam. As the white cloud cleared away, there was a flurry of activity as passengers began to disembark. Janet's eyes darted from one face to the next, searching for Lars. Wives and girlfriends met husbands and sweethearts. Mothers hugged sons whom they feared they would never see again. Women cried, men grinned from ear to ear, and children laughed. The men had returned to joyous homecomings. And then, through the crowd, Janet spotted him. Lars stood tall and handsome in his corporal's uniform, his eyes also searching through the happy confusion. Janet's pulse quickened, and she raised her hand to wave. For an instant, time stood still, and Janet saw only Lars and his green eyes. Lars's face broke into a wide grin when he spotted Janet. She was even more lovely than he remembered, her golden hair catching the sunlight, her blue eyes shining. It had been so long. He had been in the trenches, and now he was home, and Janet was just a few feet away. He began to make his way toward her, his steps quickening. Janet found herself moving as well, drawn to Lars as if by some invisible force. They came together, initially tentative, as if afraid that this moment might shatter like a dream upon waking. But as the distance between them closed, their hesitation melted away. Lars let his duffel bag slip from his fingers. In an instant, they were in each other's arms. Janet fell into Lars's embrace, inhaling the familiar scent of home she had missed for so long. She buried her face in his shoulder. His heart pounded against her. Lars held her tightly, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other pressed firmly in the small of her back. They pulled apart just enough to look into each other's eyes. Without a word, their lips met in a kiss that began tenderly and turned passionate. The world around them faded away. The noise of the train station, the noise of reuniting families, even the warm sun. All of it disappeared. At that moment, there was only Janet and Lars, lost in their own private universe. As they kissed, desire coursed through Janet's body. She pulled herself closer to Lars, feeling the hardness of his body against her soft belly. Lars responded in kind, his hands roaming her back, pulling her even closer into him. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. They gazed at each other, their eyes conveying all the words that couldn't be spoken in public. Janet's cheeks were red, her lips swollen. Lars looked at her with love and growing desire. Janet smiled as she brushed the back of her hand along his jaw.
Your hair is so short, and you've lost weight.
Lars struggled to find his words.
You are more beautiful than I remembered.
He kissed her again.
Let's go home,
Lars said, his voice husky with emotion. Janet just smiled at her husband, standing in front of her after so long, unable to speak, past the lump in her throat. They turned to leave the platform hand in hand, and she was complete once again. As they left the station, the sun bathed their backs in warmth while a gentle breeze carried away the last traces of their time apart. Janet and Lars were young and in love, and the world was full of possibilities. Janet couldn't wait to start their life together anew. They had all the time in the world. The Killer of Rome by Tim Whalen.
You've been listening to The Killer of Rome, written by Tim Whalen. That's me. This audiobook is dedicated to the memory of my friend Ted, whose spirit lives again, if only briefly, within these pages. I spent 7 months creating this audiobook. It is a blend of more than a dozen voice actors, AI-generated voices, sound effects, and original music. This audiobook features performances by Allie, Bryn, Debbie, Jody, Kent, Mariah, Matt, Ramsey, Sean, Sheila, Tegan, and Wendy. Thank you all. Oh, and I read a few parts too. And finally, thanks to you for listening. It means a lot. The Killer of Rome was first published in March of 2025. This audiobook edition was published and released in February of 2026. Copyright 2025 and 2026 by Tim Whalen. All rights reserved. The next Dan Kelly novel, The Kid from the Track, will be out by the end of 2026. For more information on all things Dan Kelly, visit dankelly.ca.